Guidance for listeners. Please be aware that this episode of Meet Me at the Museum contains audio which some may find upsetting.
Be my friend, now Lord, be.
She's one of those people who we should know her name like we know Rosa Parks.
Yes.
We should know her name like we know Maya Angelou. We should know her name like we know Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
But many people don't. It's Fannie Lou Hamer.
While on this tedious journey.
I am Malik Al Nasir, a poet and social activist from Liverpool, and I'm also a PhD student at the University of Cambridge, and I'm here today with Dr. Leona Vaughn, my friend and colleague, at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. There's no escaping the reality of what these warehouses were for, and you know, to have something like this here at the Albert Dock, being outside the main building that is now what we call the Martin Luther King building, it's a bittersweet sort of reality. When I stand in, I look at these grand pillars and I think back to, you know, it was the former Granada TV studios, it's part of the Albert Dock, and now it's a part of the Slavery Museum. It evokes all kinds of, you know, feelings.
The sugar, the cotton, all of the things that came through here all obviously came because of our involvement in slavery and colonialism. I have mixed feelings about the Slavery Museum. Not the actual museum itself, but I think just, you know, like yourself, my family are descended from enslaved Africans. It's a very emotional experience coming to the museum. I'm actually really glad that we're here and there's no one else around, because I've got to say, when I've been here before, I've sort of whipped around the exhibition because it evokes a lot of feelings and emotions that you don't necessarily want to have out on show surrounded by crowds of tourists and school children. At the end of the day, this is a personal story. These are my ancestors, and I think that hits differently than when you're just an observer. I'm glad that we're here, and I'm glad that no one else is.
Yeah, you know, I research slavery and the slave trade, so I have to, in many ways, divorce myself from the subject matter in order to be able to get through it.
Exactly.
Because it's so traumatic. But yeah, mixed feelings about that. Should we go inside and have a look?
Yeah, let's go round the side.
Come on, then. Hi, I'm Malik Al Nasir.
I'm Leona Vaughn, and this is Meet Me at the Museum.
So, this is the entranceway of the Maritime Museum here in Merseyside, and we're just walking through now into the main auditorium, into what would normally be a bustling museum, but because of lockdown, there's really not a lot going on. That's a hollow echo, that, isn't it, in this room?
It's quite eerie, actually.
You can feel that sense of being back in time, can't you? Oh yeah, there's the sign there, the third floor.
Third floor, yeah. So
Yeah.
we need to take the lift then, or the stairs.
I think I'll go with the lift.
Third floor. Doors opening.
They will remember that we were sold, but not that we were strong. They will remember that we were bought, but not that we were brave. William Prescott, former slave, 1937. Wow.
Do you know what? That really speaks to me, that, because so many people say, you know, slavery is so far in the past. Why aren't people over it? You know, why are people still talking about reparations? Why are they talking about the impact of it so long ago? But 1937 is just before the Second World War. This museum explores how millions of Africans were forced into slavery, the crucial part that Liverpool played in this process, and how there are permanent consequences for people living in Africa, the Caribbean, North and South America and Western Europe. This story has been neglected by too many for too long.
Totally neglected. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I'm glad that there is a slavery museum, as traumatic as it is. But you know, it's funny, as we're walking down here, they've got this granite column all the way along with these inscriptions in, and it's almost like a walk of shame, you know. We've got our own William Roscoe, an abolitionist, you know, here in Liverpool, but a beneficiary of slavery. You know, we've got
That's the complication of history, though, isn't it?
It's
I mean,
very
it is
nuanced.
complicated.
It's very, very nuanced.
I've got to say, though, one of the things I notice as a black woman I'm thinking, where are the women?
No,
We've
there's
got
no
Frederick
women here.
Douglass, we've got Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
Really important people.
Yeah, we could have done with someone like Sojourner Truth,
Yeah.
you know,
It
Harriet
just
Tubman.
strikes me as soon as I walk in. It's like, okay, where's our voice?
Yeah, Harriet Tubman would be, appropriate here. Maybe that's something we can suggest to the museum. Leona, the reason I brought you here today is so we could have a look around the International Slavery Museum here at Liverpool's Maritime Museum, and just to get a sense of, my major interest, which is the study of my own ancestry back through slavery.
I mean, that's incredible, really, because I've really struggled to find my family history. So my dad's from Barbados. Obviously, his family were born into slavery. They were enslaved Africans. They also moved to Panama at some point and then back to Barbados. So it's even more difficult. I mean, the irony of it as well, sort of like your name, Watson, your family name, Scottish name, my name, Vaughn, very, again, a Celtic name. We think Welsh, but, people wouldn't necessarily claim us. I mean, I've known you for way over 20 years, but probably it's only recently that I've known about your family history and the amount of research that you've done on your own about slavery in your family.
Yeah, because when we met, I think probably it was about 2 years after we met, that I started doing the research into the black Victorian footballer, Andrew Watson, who was my namesake, because obviously I was Mark Watson. I converted to Islam and changed my name to Malik Al Nasir, but my family is Watsons going back generations. And when Andrew Watson's character was brought to life on BBC Scotland documentary about the world's first black footballer who captained the Scottish national side in the 1880s, I started looking into him because, there was illustrations of this guy and he looked like me, but he was born in
like you.
1856, do you know what I mean? And the same family name, come from Demerara, same part of Guyana as my father. So that started me on a journey to find that family history. But Leona, to be honest, it's something I've done in the background. It never came to prominence in my life. It was always a little like a hobby. I had no idea when I started on that journey that I would uncover this whole connection to this big sugar conglomerate, Sandbach Tinney. Samuel Sandbach, the namesake of it, was a Lord Mayor of Liverpool in 1831. One of his nephews designed the Port of Liverpool building, And these guys formed the Bank of Liverpool. And he was the chairman of the Bank of Liverpool, and many of the family members were directors of the Bank of Liverpool, and it was all predicated on, the proceeds of slavery, primarily from the Caribbean. So I had no idea that I was connected to these people, and when I started looking deeper into the family tree, I found family connections to Prime Minister Gladstone. This was insane. I had to resign myself to the reality that I was not only descendant of slaves, but I was descendant of slave traders. Yeah. These people are my family. They're in my family tree. I've got Prime Minister Gladstone in my family tree.
And it was only really when we met for lunch one day, didn't we? And you said, I've bought these archives. I'd like to show them to you.
Did I bring the archive?
Yeah.
I showed you the archive.
I came to yours and you got these
God.
archives out and I was just like, this is an incredible treasure trove. But I was doing my PhD at the time as well, wasn't I? And I was just like, Malik, this is a PhD. You should be doing a PhD.
Wow, Leona, look at all these instruments here. You got birimbaus. I thought the birimbau was from Brazil. I thought they developed it in Brazil. I didn't realise they had African ones as well.
Okay.
And djembes and all kinds of artefacts here from West Africa.
It's really nice, isn't it, to actually see that we start with some African art and artefacts rather than it being like slavery, chains and, it's actually saying, look, this is the source of it. This is where it began. There was a life and a history before slavery.
Yeah, I think it's like Mutabaruka said, slavery is not African history. African history was interrupted by slavery.
Absolutely. Well, this bit is called Enslavement in the Middle Passage. So it kind of starts off with the African story and those very things that you say, that Africa was developed in its own right.
Should we have a look?
Yeah, let's go in. Wow, it's really quite dark in here, isn't it? You feel quite encased.
And so it should be. It was a dark chapter. The Voyage of the Essex. On the 13th of June, 1783, the ship Essex left Liverpool on a slaving voyage. The details of this voyage have been reconstructed using original documents in the museum's archives. And there's a picture here of the Africans packed like sardines, chained into the slave ships, all naked and lying literally one next to the other. But I think what is so profound about this image to me is the fact that they put a child right at the bow of the ship, because that's the narrowest point on the ship, and it wasn't obviously wide enough to be able to put an adult, but they thought, okay, we can fit one child in there, so let's stick an extra one in. And this just shows you the level of barbarity. But also the way that they've sanitised it. It becomes a mathematical, it's a problem to solve, isn't it? It's like, how many people can we actually get in here to make the maximum amount of money? What's the configuration? Yeah. And I don't, when you think these guys were doing this in the 1700s on sail ships, if the wind didn't blow, how long would it take to get across? They were totally dependent upon the wind for that ship to move. And as an old seaman myself, I know that, if you're sailing from West Africa to America, that's 2 weeks on a motor vessel with, the propellers operating 24 hours a day. Yeah. So if you're on a sail ship where you're dependent on the power of the wind, that could take months to make that journey. And you'd be lying there in your own feces and vomits and excrements, and people would have got sick. And, when they got sick, you couldn't sell them for full price at the market because they were ill, so you would throw them overboard and claim the insurance instead. Wow, yeah. Because people were commodified. They were just classed as property. So Leona, I think we should have a walk through this particular video exhibit here. It's called The Middle Passage, A Voyage Through Death. The harrowing account of people being transported from West Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas. Wow, okay, this is a really sort of suffocating space, isn't it? And I think that probably that's purposefully so. Yeah, even the acoustics in this room sort of make you feel as though you're in a confined space and your voice is sort of echoing back at you. Possibly that gives a sense of what it might have been like in the hull of a ship. This is probably about the same width as the hull of the ship where the slaves were packed into. When my children have come here on trips, this is the bit that always affects them the most. Seeing what you would see through the eyes of a person who was enslaved on that ship. That whole feeling, the seasickness, the noise, the crying, people vomiting. It's really powerful. I think it's important to have something like this in the museum. You're immersed in the reality of the experience. You can't escape it, can you? You can't escape it. It's inescapable in this space, and that's the point. You couldn't escape the ship. You're in the middle of the ocean. You can skim past, you can walk past something quickly, you can read it really quickly and get out of the way. But in this part of the exhibition, it kind of makes you have to face the reality of that trip and of the brutality and the evilness. It's kind of designed to trap you in the space and force you to face it. Yeah. It's harrowing. This museum, as painful as it is, it's a story that has to be told. It's got to be told because people don't see it. They get the sanitised version of how Britain became great, how we become this great power. They don't get the true version. Well, I think if you're willing to sanitise history in the way that you describe, then what you are essentially doing is being incredibly disingenuous to future generations, because you're denying them the opportunity to understand why we are how we are. And when you consider the kind of polarization that exists in society now on racial grounds, on class grounds, and the kind of protests and things that we've seen in the wake of, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter, you would struggle to understand that connection.
Exactly.
You wouldn't be able to. It would be like trying to work out algebra or something where you don't even have enough bits in the equation to be able to come to a conclusion. To have that formula to work it out, you've got to know all the bits in the equation. And this is what I'm about with my research. It's through my family history, is really just being able to go back through history and unpick it, and not to try and fit it into some sort of, paradigm based on, what this academic said or what that academic said. For me, it's about letting the documents speak. And the beauty of a place like this, the Slavery Museum, the Maritime Museum, is that you have the archival material here, and you can let the words emerge from the pages and tell us the story. The past can speak to us through these
in a way
archives.
that our ancestors weren't allowed to. Our ancestors weren't given that voice. They don't have that voice, but we can give them that voice through archives and exhibits, and I think that that's important. We couldn't tell the story of the Second World War without talking about the Holocaust, right? So we have to tell this story. I always say to my kids, and my kids were not particularly happy with this museum. Every Black History Month, the school would make them come to the museum. And, my daughter turned around and went, "We've got more history than just slavery. That's not even our history, is it, Mum?" And I completely hear it. I completely get it. But I also say to her, actually, it is our history, and we should be proud of where we are now. So when I look at this space, Malik, it feels like it is a ship, And I wonder if they've purposefully designed it like that.
I think they have. I think they've created the exhibit in the shape of a ship to give that sense of being on a ship.
And there's so much here, isn't there?
There is. There's a lot of artefacts here. But I think we can take a quick look around. But first, I think I'd like to have a little chat with the director of the International Slavery Museum, Dr. Richard Benjamin.
Hello there, good to see you.
Oh, nice to see you.
Hi, how
Hello
are you,
there.
Richard? It's been a while. Just wanted to get a little bit of background from you about the history of the Liverpool Slavery Museum.
We're in the Merseyside Maritime Museum building. We're on the 3rd floor. But in the early 90s, in the basement of this building, of the Maritime Museum, was the Transatlantic Slavery Gallery.
Yeah, and I came here.
Yeah, you will have done. Very popular, millions of visitors. I visited myself before I became head of the museum in 2006 many, many times. And it did a great job, but one of the things it didn't do was really talk about contemporary issues. It was very much a maritime history, chronological look at transatlantic slavery. But museums develop and audiences develop and demand different types of information, and museums need to be relevant. So decision was taken 2003, 2004, that rather than just being a gallery within a museum, you should be a museum yourself on the same level of status as the British Museum or the National Portrait Gallery. So plans were put in place to close the gallery and to move the museum, the new museum, onto the 3rd floor where we are now. And I'm sure you know this, you probably were present. We opened on the 23rd of August 2007, and we've had 4 million visitors. And, it's basically split into 3 galleries. Life in West Africa, to give people some kind of concept and grounding in when we talk about Africa and African people, and not just to see this as a European story. The agency is African agency for the museum. And we're in the Enslavement and Middle Passage Gallery. Talks about Liverpool's role, Britain's role, life in the Americas. Talks about the Middle Passage and that horrendous journey. And then there's the Legacies Gallery that I know we'll go into. And that's what brings the museum up to date. It talks about very relevant issues for Liverpool and the country as a whole, the legacies of transatlantic slavery. So there's a potted history.
So I recall around that time that Peter Moores, a very prominent businessman in Liverpool,
That's right.
gifted some money to get the whole thing
Yeah.
off the ground, and it was quite controversial, Leona, as I recall. There was a lot of controversy in the community about it at the time as to whether there should be one, whether there shouldn't be one, what it should
Yeah.
look like, and
Yeah.
you know, do you recall those times?
I do, yeah. I also recall the Lord Mayor of the city at the time refusing to acknowledge that the city had any role in the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Because I think that the museum brought Maya Angelou, didn't they?
It did.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was here. I mean, you know, what a figure. And that's right. So when it opened in 1994, she did attend the opening. So, you know, they got people of that ilk to be associated with the museum project or the gallery project, and that was really important.
So in terms of today's sort of conversation around racism and the kind of political polarization that has been with the Black Lives Matter movement and, you know, George Floyd and so on, how does an institution like this sort of connect, if you like, with those contemporary issues in that way?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Well, first thing is you know you need to be relevant, and I've talked about this. So you need to be a conduit for these discussions. You know, museums are not neutral spaces. You take a stance. So how do you become an anti-racist museum? It's a big thing, isn't it? You know, and it's not going to be something overnight. We have diverse staff. We have staff with personal experience and professional experience who are probably more able to develop and cope with subjects like this than other members of and colleagues within the larger organisation that is National Museums Liverpool. So what you do is you support your colleagues who maybe aren't aware of the issues. So museums can tell you about something. They can give you the past and they can give you ideas of what to do in the future. But personally, I think that if you want to be anti-racist, then you need to go out and find out what it means. Talk to people about their experiences, and maybe you'll make a difference if you do something positive yourself.
So when I've come here before when I've brought people from all over the world, I find myself moving really quickly through the gallery, really quickly through the space, because I just feel like I just am not ready to engage with it in that way.
Yeah.
What's your feelings and what's your favourite bit of the gallery?
Well, I do feel a particular affiliation with the whole museum because I'm intimately involved in, I suppose, a lot of the decisions and why things came about. And I know when I walk through the museum, I kind of know the history of how everything is here, both good and bad. You know, not everything worked. But like yourselves, you know, I am a descendant of enslaved Africans within, and Malik, I know you obviously know this because it's dear to your heart as well, is what is now Guyana and was British Guyana and Essequibo and Demerara. And my dad's from Guyana. So, well, there's a sense of pride that I'm here and I can make a difference. But I always think of my dad and my own family. So, yeah, there's numerous locations. We can go and have a look at one in particular. If it's a commemorative coin that was in 1970 when Guyana became a republic, been independent since
66.
66, that's right. So Guyanese citizens were given a commemorative coin of what was called the Berbice slave revolt.
Is this the one from the 1823 revolt with Cuffy on the back of it?
That is indeed, right.
I have one of those.
Have you got one yourself?
I've got one in my
Right,
collection, yeah.
Oh, marvellous. Well, this was given to my dad when the museum opened in 2007. I asked my dad if he'd be interested in loaning the object to the museum. So we can go now through the galleries, and I can take you to one of the objects that means quite a lot.
Sure, let's go.
So we're here in the Legacies Gallery, and we're actually specifically near what's called the Fight for Freedom and Equality Wall, and that talks about 400 years of revolts and rebellions and resistance to being enslaved. And the display case that's in front of us here now has a number of very poignant objects, particularly to people like yourself from Liverpool. As you can see next to the Cuffy dollar here, we actually have a police helmet from the Toxteth uprisings. So because this is the racism and discrimination section, you've got a kind of a mixture of objects which kind of give you different elements of that subject matter. And we've also got a T-shirt there, as you will see, with Angela Davis. That's right.
I've had a little bit of a cold chill as you do this because I'm actually currently writing a memoir, and part of my memoir is about the 1981 Toxteth riots. And you've got the poster here, Oxford Out, which was the anti-Ken Oxford march
That's it, yeah.
that we did during the Toxteth riots. The riots paused for a day because they started on a Friday, and I can't, it was a few days in, they paused and we had the anti-Ken Oxford March, and I was on that march. And there's actually a photograph, and I'm in the second row where it's got the, I'm 15-year-old me with an afro in the second row. I literally remember the day we marched from Sefton Park, from the obelisk in Sefton Park, and someone had made a coffin to commemorate the death of David Moore, who was killed by a police Land Rover. It's the first and only one of 2 marches I've ever been on in my life. We marched from the obelisk in Sefton Park to St George's Hall. And the Liverpool 8 Black Sisters were right at the front of the march, and we were singing Ain't No Stopping Us Now, We're on the Move. And I'm in the second row there with all the Black Sisters in the front row, leading the charge, I might add, underneath the banner of the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee. And we chanted Oxford out all the way there. And literally the police on that day completely and utterly backed off and did not challenge us. And we got all the way there and had a massive rally at St George's Hall. So this is, you know, to have the Cuffy dollar, which I also have one in my own collection, at the front, the police helmet to the side. Yeah. So there's a lot of history going on in that one little exhibit.
What you have just said, and that story that you've just told us, that is the power of museums. Because in here, many people would see an interesting poster with a little label. You've just told us a story. A museum's about telling stories.
I was there.
You were there.
Looking at these characters along this wall, it's the whole thing. We've got Harriet Tubman here.
Well, that's good, because I mentioned before, you know, black women's voices are really important in this story.
It would have been good if Harriet Tubman would have been at the entrance, because they were all male voices as we were walking in on the wall.
But that's the development of museums. The late, great Dorothy Cooyer, a critical friend of the museum and someone that advised me on many occasions. And one of the things Dorothy used to say is, look, you know, you do need more women's voices in here. And that's relevant because actually behind us, where we're talking now, is one of the displays called the Black Achievers Wall. And if you walk over to the Black Achievers area, you'll get over 75 Black Achievers from history, contemporary, and over 50% of those are women. And that was something that I always remembered when Dorothy said to me, you need more women's voices, so we made a deliberate effort that when we do put new Black Achievers on the wall, and we put a few up every year or so, then there's it's mainly women in recent years, and rightly so.
I'm loving the fact we got Shirley Chisholm over here. That was the first black woman to ever run for, was it for Congress? Did she run for Congress?
Congress, yeah.
And then she ran for president, didn't she?
She did, Democrat.
I do not intend to offer to you the tired and glib cliches which for too long have been an accepted part of our political life. I am the candidate of the people of America.
So who's your favourite sister on the wall here, Leona?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one to choose actually. But I'd probably say Olive Morris.
Okay.
Yes.
And I think that Olive Morris for me is more of what she could have become. You know, she embodied the potential for black women in the 70s.
Yes,
you know, you know, she died when she was what, 31, 32, 70, something really, really young. But you know, a real activist, grassroots organiser.
Absolutely.
You know,
I think for me, it's Fannie Lou Hamer. I think Fannie Lou Hamer was one of the most underrepresented civil rights activists.
Yeah, less known, isn't it?
I mean, she sang. She was an incredible singer, but she only ever sang at protest rallies.
Walk with me. Jesus. While I'm on.
She never ever sang commercially.
Right.
And she would turn up.
That's right.
And she would represent the interests of people seeking the vote. And she was constantly under threat from the Ku Klux Klan.
That's it.
She was constantly being maligned. She was constantly being abused, threatened. And this woman had absolute faith in what she was doing, that she was representative of a just cause.
Be my friend while I'm on.
She's one of those people who we should know her name like we know Rosa Parks.
Yes.
We should know her name like we know Maya Angelou. We should know her name like we know Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
But many people don't.
Oh, Malik, we've got to look at this painting. It is probably, I'd say actually it's probably my favourite painting.
It's epic.
Of all times. But it is certainly my favourite painting in terms of what it represents. It's called The Hunted Slaves, and it's by Richard Ansdell. It looks like he painted it in 1863.
Yeah, 1833. Presented by G. Winter Moss Esquire, 1863. It is huge. It takes up an entire wall.
I just love what it represents. So this is two escaped enslaved people. So it's set in a field of cane. It looks like sugar cane from what I know from Barbados. And they're being chased by dogs. And these dogs are rabid animals frothing at the mouth, you know, slobbering, teeth bared. And you've got the male enslaved African with an axe raised, protecting the woman from the dogs. And you can see on his wrist is
the manacles.
The manacles, one of which is open and the other one is still attached to him. And it's just, I just think it's a really powerful painting.
I've never seen this image before, but what it suggests to me is something from a visual narrative that we don't often see, and that is the black man protecting the black woman.
Exactly.
And I always remember reading Bell Hooks, the black feminist, when she wrote that book, Ain't I a Woman?
Yeah.
Based on Sojourner Truth. And she said that one of the things about slavery was that it emasculated the black man and made it impossible for him to protect the black woman, and the black woman ceased to respect the black man because he failed to protect her. But what you find here is an image where the black man is, in fact, escaping from the bonds of slavery and is not only protecting the black woman, he's slaying the dogs that have been put on. And one of these dogs is actually lying, you know, on its back, having been taken out with the axe. The two that are coming at him, he is fearlessly going at them. And the black woman is behind him, you know, being protected by the black man.
And it makes me think of, you know, Black Lives Matter at the moment. You know, we're having to say explicitly, protect black women. You know, black women are taking the brunt.
And black women are at the forefront of Black Lives Matter too.
Absolutely. And you know, you only have to look at the wall here to see that that's the history that black women have led from the front and the middle and the back of the movement.
They haven't had the credit for their role.
And they've also not always had the protection. And that's what I love. I just love this picture.
I think it tells a story that we haven't heard. And I think it's a story yet to be told.
Yeah. Because slavery disrupted family. You know, you weren't allowed to marry. You weren't allowed to keep your children. But here, you know, it's just a different depiction.
And I think, you know, the current scenario within the black community, where you have a high disproportionate amount of single-parent families, is another legacy of slavery. So it's one thing for people to look at the black community and say how dysfunctional it is. It's another thing to understand where that dysfunction came from.
Hi. Hello.
Hi, how are you today?
Yeah, pretty good, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Sarah Han and I work at the museum as education manager. So my area, actually, the audience that I focus on is young people and adults. We have an education programme that links to the content in the International Slavery Museum.
So what sort of work do you do with young people then, Sarah? Because obviously this is a really emotional museum, isn't it? You know, it must bring up lots of feelings in the young people as they go through it.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive subject matter that we're dealing with. It's people's lived experiences often, so you have to be really, really mindful of the fact that you might be talking to young people who've got direct experience through their heritage. So we are very, very mindful of that. So we've got a session called Understanding Transatlantic Slavery. And that's one where we obviously look at the subject matter of transatlantic slavery, who was affected, how it came to be. But before they even take part in that session, we make sure that all the students that are going to take part have an activity beforehand with their teachers where they discuss language and the power of language and the words that can cause emotions to come up or can be offensive or appropriate language to use. So, for instance, in relation to African people, you wouldn't refer to a person as a slave because actually that suggests that that it's sort of inherent in their being. You have to refer to somebody as being enslaved because it was something that was done to that person. So it's about getting them to understand the language that to use to give them the power to talk about the subject. Although it is about transatlantic slavery, we don't want to focus purely on that, because the people that were enslaved before they were enslaved had lives. They were mothers, they were grandmothers, they were workers, they had, they've got an entire rich heritage of skills and trades that they were able to do beforehand. And also during their time being enslaved, there was lots of examples of resistance. So we like to talk about, obviously, the atrocities, but we talk about the resistance alongside to try and balance the picture.
What have we got here then?
Yep, we've got a couple of handling objects on a table because we do use objects in the sessions. We always start off by explaining absolutely people can have a huge emotional response to these objects, and we have to be respectful of them because, of course, they are connected to quite a very traumatic history. One of the things we've got on the table is something that's called a punishment collar. It's a metal ring that opens. It's quite a heavy metal ring. It opens and unfortunately it fits round a person's neck. Going up from the back of that ring is like a tall, thin arm, really. It looks like an arm.
Like a hand, doesn't
with a
it?
hand, yeah. It looks like a hand at the top. Now, it's believed that actually the enslaved African people were made to make these. And actually, just looking at it as a craft point of view, there's a lot of work goes into that and skill. It's very, very heavy, so it would have caused a lot of pain when it was worn, and it would have restricted movement because of this hand shape that goes either up the back toward the back of the head, or it can go in front of the mouth, which would obviously prevent people from being able to communicate properly verbally. However...
Or eat.
Yeah. It is believed, though, that this hand shape at the top is representative of a symbol within African culture. Now, we don't know whether it's within Nigerian, within Ghanaian, but it's within African culture.
The hands of Fatima.
Yeah, so it's like a resistance symbol that would make sense to other enslaved people and would be sort of a little bit like a fingers up to the plantation owners. People are able to touch this, but obviously we don't let anybody put it on or wear it. It has to be
Can I
treated
hold it?
really. You can hold it.
I just want to feel
just
the
simply
physical
how
weight
heavy
of
it
it.
is.
The weight is something that really gets the
that
idea
is
across.
like just feeling the weight of that and thinking if I had that on my shoulders and this thing up the back of my neck, it would be not only incredibly uncomfortable, but it would be quite debilitating as well. Grotesque.
And dehumanising, isn't it?
So we're at the end of, I think, some very traumatic and quite memorable episodes in this chapter of enslavement at the museum, Leona. I'm having very mixed feelings about this. I don't know what your experience has been like today.
I think the legacies bit is the bit that'll stick with me the most. You know, that's really developed a lot since I was last at the museum. And it's great to see the representation, the people who've achieved, people who inspire our next generation, whether they're local people or whether they're, from all around the world. I've mentioned a few times, haven't I, about my children. Next time I bring them, I might start there, start with the legacy rather than start with slavery.
And is that really to try and sort of start more on a positive? Or?
Yeah, just to switch up the narrative as well. I think that they think of this museum as just being all about slavery, the misery of slavery. I think that the legacies section definitely is a feeling of empowerment. That's why I would start there. And it's an element of black people telling their own story. The story of slavery isn't necessarily told by black voices, although it's told through the artefacts and the exhibitions. And so for my kids especially, I think that they need to see the journey that's being travelled. Their kids, they feel embarrassed that their ancestors were slaved.
You okay? Yeah. It's incredibly emotive, Leona,
It's difficult conversations to have with the kids.
Yeah. We've got a lot as a people to be proud of, and I think we need to encourage our children to stand proud and to not be embarrassed by what was done to us in any way, shape or form in much the same way as you would tell a victim of a crime not to be embarrassed about having been the victim of a crime. If anyone should be embarrassed, it's the perpetrators. I think it's for us as parents to contextualise what happened, but also to uncover the full narratives of slavery, and to understand that, you know, within the context of that we do have a lot to be proud of. We as a people survived slavery. We as a people have emerged despite slavery. We stand here today. You're a PhD doctor. I'm reading for a PhD at Cambridge. And we are part of the legacy of slavery, but we're doing incredible things for our children as role models and also for our people. Despite slavery, we stand tall, and that's got to be a positive for our kids. The story is bad. The history is bad. The outcomes were traumatic and harrowing. However, we stand strong. And I think that should be the takeaway from it. And that certainly is the takeaway from me, and that's what I try to instill in my children.
It makes me think of that quote, I am the dreams and hope of a slave. And we are.
While I'm on this tedious journey, I want Jesus to walk with me.
Thanks for listening to Meet Me at the Museum with me, Malik Al Nasir.
And me, Leona Vaughn, at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool.
If you like this episode of the podcast, please rate, subscribe, or tell a friend.
And don't forget, you can show your love for museums with a National Art Pass. It gives you great benefits at hundreds of venues at the same time as raising money to support them.